How could an empire forged by the might of Charlemagne, the greatest sovereign of his age, find itself brought to its knees by a fleet of river pirates? And why did the Frankish warning system of fortified bridges and coastal lookouts, a network designed to prevent this very scenario, fail so catastrophically in the autumn of the year of our Lord 885? The answer does not lie on the prows of dragon-headed longships, but in the gilded, fractured halls of power. The great Carolingian Empire was a corpse long before the ravens from the north arrived to feast upon it. It had died with its founder. His grandsons, the pious and the pathetic, had carved up his legacy with swords, dividing the indivisible, turning brother against brother in a series of ruinous civil wars. They drew lines on maps with blood and ink, creating the kingdom of the West Franks, the kingdom of the East Franks and Middle Francia, fragile states born of ambition and destined for conflict. They saw the enemy in their own kin across a newly drawn border and never thought to look to the cold grey sea. This was the weakness the Northmen, the Vikings, were born to exploit. They were not a mindless horde. They were masters of opportunistic warfare, the ultimate predators of a dying political ecosystem. They did not need to conquer land, for they were masters of the water. Their genius was the river. The Vikings understood that rivers were the arteries of the Frankish kingdom, the highways of commerce and communication. To control the rivers was to hold a knife to the throat of the kingdom itself. Their vessel, the legendary Drakkar, was a masterpiece of naval engineering, a spectre of the waterways. With a shallow draft, it could navigate far inland, sailing up rivers where no other seagoing warship dared to venture. It was swift, capable of appearing as if from nowhere, and light enough to be carried overland between river systems, a maneuver that left Frankish strategists utterly bewildered. The Northmen would strike a town like Rouen, a rich trading hub on the Seine, appearing at dawn, their terrifying dragon prows emerging from the river mist. They would slaughter, plunder, and burn, and by the time a local count could muster his armored cavalry, the Vikings and their loot-laden ships would be gone, vanished back down the river, leaving only smoke, silence, and terror. They were ghosts made of wood and steel, and the Empire, with its slow, ponderous land armies, was powerless to stop them. They struck Nantes at the mouth of the Loire, sacking the city during a religious festival, even killing the bishop at his own altar. Each successful raid was a story told in the winter halls of Scandinavia, a song of silver and easy slaughter that drew more warriors to the cause. The raids grew bolder, more audacious. The Vikings were no longer content with coastal towns. They sought the heart. In the year 845, a legendary chieftain whose sagas would later call Ragnar Lothbrok decided to aim for the greatest prize of all, Paris. He led a fleet of 120 ships up the Seine. The king of the West Franks, Charles the Bald, a grandson of Charlemagne, did what any sensible ruler would do. He divided his army and placed it on both banks of the river to trap the invaders. It was a catastrophic mistake. The Vikings, seeing the smaller force, landed and annihilated one half of the Frankish army in plain sight of the other, which was powerless to cross the river and help. To add psychological terror to his military victory, Ragnar hanged 111 Frankish prisoners on an island in the Seine, a sacrifice to his god Odin, and a gruesome message to the king. Paris, panicked and defenseless, fell silent. Charles the Bald, seeing his army broken and his capital at the mercy of the Northmen, did not choose to fight. He chose to pay. He offered Ragnar 7,000 pounds of silver, an immense fortune, to simply leave. This was the first Danegeld paid in the kingdom of the Franks, a tribute that would set a disastrous precedent. Ragnar sailed away, his ships heavy with silver, his name etched into legend. But the message his victory sent was not one of Frankish pragmatism, it was one of Frankish weakness. The silver of Paris did not sate the Vikings' hunger, it whetted their appetite. It was proof that the heart of the once mighty empire was not only vulnerable but also soft, willing to trade its honor for a fleeting peace. Every chieftain in Scandinavia now knew the route to wealth. It was not through the treacherous North Sea to raid the hardened Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. It was up the gentle, undefended rivers of Francia. The kingdom of the Franks had effectively placed a bounty on its own head. The lesson that should have been learned in 845, that paying tribute to an aggressor only guarantees their return, was utterly ignored. Instead, the Frankish kings continued their internal squabbles, their petty wars over inheritance and titles, while the northern threat metastasized. They built a few fortified bridges, but their strategy remained defensive, reactive, and ultimately futile. They feared the dragons from the north, not noticing that the real enemy sat on the throne, not on a drakkar. A generation of Vikings grew up on tales of Ragnar's easy triumph, and they dreamed of repeating it, but on a much, much grander scale. They would get their chance. In the latter half of the 9th century, a vast coalition of Viking warbands, known as the Great Heathen Army, had descended upon England. For years they had ravaged the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, conquering Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia, fighting the legendary Alfred the Great of Wessex to a standstill. But England was a hard land and the fighting was costly. After a major defeat, a large contingent of this battle-hardened army sought easier prey and richer plunder. Their eyes turned south, back to the divided and wealthy lands of the Franks. Their goal was no longer a simple raid for silver, but a campaign of conquest and settlement. They were not just warriors, they were migrants, bringing their families, their blacksmiths, their entire society with them. This was not a summer raid. It was a nation on the move, a force of nature seeking a new home. In the year 885, this formidable host, a floating city of warriors, gathered at the mouth of the Seine. Their target was once again Paris, but this time they were not coming for a quick payment. They were coming for everything. The Chronicles, written by terrified monks, struggled to convey the scale of the fleet that assembled. The numbers are almost mythic, likely exaggerated by fear, but they speak to a terrifying truth. Some accounts claim 700 ships, others more. These vessels, packed with warriors, weapons, and siege engines, stretched for miles along the river. A conservative estimate places the number of Viking warriors at 30, perhaps even 40,000 men. This was the largest single invading force the kingdom of the Franks had ever faced. It was an army that could challenge and likely defeat the entire military might of the enfeebled Carolingian rulers. At its head were chieftains whose names were already whispered in fear across Europe, men like the cunning and notoriously greedy Siegfried. He saw Paris not merely as a treasury, but as a key, the strategic lock that, once broken, would open the entire kingdom to his armies. If Paris fell, the rich lands of Burgundy and beyond would be defenseless. This was a campaign born of decades of successful raiding, fueled by a generation of greed, and executed by the most experienced warriors of the Viking age. The northern storm had finally gathered, and it was about to break upon the heart of Francia. The defenders of the realm were not entirely unprepared, or so they thought. The Frankish kings had ordered the construction of fortified bridges at key points along the rivers, designed to block the passage of longships. One such choke point was at Pont de l'Arche, downstream from Paris. It was a double bridge, heavily garrisoned, a supposedly impassable barrier. The approaching Vikings knew of it, but they possessed a simple and brutal solution. They did not try to fight their way through it. They landed their forces, bypassed the fortifications on foot, and attacked the garrisons from the landward side, where the defenses were weakest. The Frankish soldiers, prepared for a naval assault, were caught completely by surprise. The forts were stormed, the defenders slaughtered, and the precious bridges were burned and dismantled. The primary line of defense for the entire Seine Valley was eliminated in a single, brilliantly executed maneuver. The Vikings had demonstrated a tactical flexibility that the rigid feudal armies of the Franks simply could not match. The river to Paris was now wide open. Word of the disaster spread like wildfire, carried by frantic refugees who had witnessed the massacre. A wave of pure, primal terror swept through the countryside. What would you feel standing on the shore and seeing that fleet? An endless forest of masts, the sun glinting off thousands of helmets and axe heads, the air thick with the sound of war horns and the rhythmic chanting of men who had come to take your life and your city. This was not war as the Franks understood it, not a clash of noble armies by formal arrangement. This was an apocalypse descending the river. Peasants abandoned their fields and their homes, grabbing what little they could carry, and fled inland or toward the perceived safety of walled towns. The rich agricultural lands of Neustria, the breadbasket of the kingdom, were left to the wolves and the Northmen. The Vikings plundered at will, burning monasteries, sacking villages, and gathering supplies for the great task that lay ahead. They moved slowly, deliberately, their progress up the river, marked by pillars of smoke that could be seen for miles. It was a campaign of psychological warfare as much as a military invasion. They were not merely advancing, they were erasing the kingdom as they went, instilling a sense of utter hopelessness in the populace. Every league they travelled up the Seine, the legend of their invincibility grew. Their destination was the small island city that stood as the last sentinel on the river, Paris. The city's fate now rested in the hands of two men. Count Odo of Paris, a rising nobleman from the powerful Robertian clan, and the city's bishop, the warrior priest Goslin. They knew what was coming. They had watched the smoke on the horizon grow closer each day. They sent desperate messages to their emperor, Charles the Fat, ruler of a reunited Carolingian realm, who was far away in Germania, dealing with his own political troubles. Help was promised, but when would it arrive? Odo and Goslin had to face the storm with what they had. Paris in the 9th century was not the sprawling metropolis of later years. It was almost entirely confined to the fortified Ile de la Cité, an island in the middle of the Seine. This geography was its greatest defensive asset. To take the island, an enemy would have to cross one of two vital bridges, the Grand Pont connecting to the right bank and the Petit Pont to the left. These bridges were the city's lifelines and its primary defense. The men of Paris knew that if the bridges fell, the city was doomed. Their entire world was about to shrink to the length of two wooden spans over a cold, dark river. The Parisians worked with feverish desperation. Under Odo's command, they reinforced the bridgeheads. At the end of the Grand Pont, on the right bank, stood a newly constructed stone tower, a formidable bastion, though it was not yet complete. Its wooden upper levels were still being finished when the first Viking scouts were spotted downriver. The Petit Pont on the left bank was protected by a simpler wooden tower. These two towers were the linchpins of the entire defense. As long as they held, the Viking fleet could not pass upriver, and the city could not be fully surrounded. Odo and Goslin mustered their garrison. The numbers were terrifyingly small. Some sources claim they had as few as 200 professional soldiers, a handful of knights in their service. The rest of the defenders were citizen militia, merchants and craftsmen, armed with spears, axes, and a desperate courage born of the knowledge that there was nowhere to run. 200 men against 30,000. The absurdity of the odds was not lost on anyone. A sense of grim finality settled over the city as they watched the horizon. The river, once their source of wealth and life, was now delivering their doom. The age of paying for peace was over. Now the price of survival would be paid in blood. What is the wiser path for a threatened nation? To confront a rising enemy with force, however slim the chances, or to pay them off, buying a temporary and dishonorable peace? The history of Paris offers a bitter lesson. And what would you choose? A costly war for your principles, or a pragmatic bribe for your survival? Let us know what you think in the comments. The Viking fleet arrived before Paris on the 25th of November in the year 885. The sight was one of pure, calculated terror. The river was so choked with ships that it seemed one could walk from bank to bank across their decks. The Northmen made no immediate move to attack. They set up a sprawling camp on the right bank of the Seine in the area of the modern-day Louvre. From the walls of the city, The defenders could see the campfires twinkling at night, stretching into the darkness, an enemy city rising to consume their own. The Viking leader, Siegfried, was a master of psychological pressure. He did not want a bloody and protracted siege if he could avoid it. He sought a parley. Accompanied by a small retinue, he approached the city gates and demanded to speak with its leader. Bishop Goslin, robed in his ecclesiastical vestments but with the hard eyes of a soldier, met him. Siegfried's offer was simple, and it echoed the deal made with Ragnar 40 years earlier. He demanded tribute, a vast sum of silver in exchange for sparing the city. But he added a new condition: his fleet must be allowed to pass Paris unimpeded, to continue up the Seine and plunder the riches of Burgundy. He was offering Paris a chance to save itself by sacrificing its countrymen. Goslin's reply, as recorded by the chronicler monk Abbot of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, who was an eyewitness to these events, was unequivocal. The bishop told the Viking chieftain that Paris was entrusted to their care, not to bring ruin upon the kingdom, but to protect it. They would not buy their own safety with the blood of their fellow Franks. Count Odo, standing beside the bishop, supported the defiant stance. This was not the craven response the Vikings had come to expect from the Franks. It was a declaration of war. Siegfried, reportedly more amused than angered by their bravery, returned to his camp. The time for talking was over. The Parisians on the walls held their breath. They had just sealed their fate. They were a tiny island of defiance in a sea of enemies, abandoned by their emperor with nothing but stone, wood, and their own courage to stand against the greatest army their world had ever seen. The siege of Paris was about to begin. Every man on the wall, from Count Odo in his mailcoat to the humble baker with a sharpened stick, knew that the coming dawn might be their last. A man is not defined by the power he wields, but by the choices he makes when he has none. Paris had chosen to fight. The first assault came on the morning of November 26th, a brutal and overwhelming display of Viking force. The primary target was the new stone tower at the northern end of the Grand Pont. It was the strongest point in the Parisian defences, but it was also the key to the entire river. If it fell, the bridge would be indefensible, and the Vikings could storm the Ile de la Cité itself. The Northmen threw everything they had at it. Thousands of warriors surged forward under a hail of arrows from their own archers, their round shields forming a solid wall. They brought with them a fearsome array of siege engines built with knowledge gathered from campaigns across the known world. Heavy battering rams, protected by wheeled sheds, were pushed toward the tower's base, their rhythmic thuds shaking the very foundations. Giant catapults and ballistae, positioned further back, hurled massive stones and iron-tipped bolts at the defenders on the battlements. The air became a storm of wood, stone, and steel. The noise was deafening, the splintering of timber, the grinding of stone, the war cries of the attackers, and the screams of the wounded. Inside the tower, the handful of Frankish defenders fought with the fury of cornered animals. Count Odo and Bishop Goslin were not commanders directing the battle from a safe distance. They were warriors in the thick of the fight. Abbot's poem describes them moving along the battlements, their armor dented, their faces blackened with soot, shouting encouragement to their men, personally fighting off Vikings who attempted to scale the walls with ladders. The defenders poured down boiling oil, pitch, and molten lead onto the attackers below, horrific weapons that turned the ground at the base of the tower into a writhing death trap. They used massive hooks to snag the siege ladders and tip them over, sending screaming men plummeting to their deaths. For 2 days and nights the battle raged without pause. The Vikings attacked in relentless waves, fresh warriors replacing the fallen, giving the defenders no time to rest, to eat, or even to tend to their grievous wounds. The small garrison was being worn down, their numbers dwindling with every passing hour. They were fighting on pure adrenaline and the stark realization that to falter for even a moment meant death for everyone on the island. The heroism displayed was breathtaking, a testament to what a few hundred determined souls could achieve against impossible odds. The Vikings, frustrated by the tower's resilience, resorted to a new and terrifying tactic. They took several of their own ships, filled them with dry wood, animal carcasses, and pitch, and set them ablaze. These fire ships were then guided toward the wooden Grand Pont, which connected the stone tower to the island city. The goal was to burn the bridge, cutting the tower off from any reinforcement or retreat, and to spread fire and panic into the city itself. The sight of these floating pyres drifting down the river under the grey winter sky must have been a vision of hell for the defenders. The heat was so intense it buckled the air. The Parisians on the city walls worked desperately, using long poles to push the burning hulks away from the bridge pilings and dousing the flames with buckets of river water. But the attack on the tower intensified. Under the cover of the smoke and chaos, the Vikings brought forward their largest siege tower, a monstrous wooden structure on wheels, bristling with archers. It was a mobile fortress designed to overtop the stone defenses and allow the attackers to pour directly onto the battlements. It seemed that the end had finally come. Just as the siege tower was being maneuvered into its final position, the defenders inside the stone keep attempted a desperate gambit. They unleashed their own secret weapon, a massive, custom-built catapult. With a tremendous groan of twisted ropes, it hurled a huge, weighted beam which smashed directly into the Viking siege tower. The wooden behemoth splintered, shuddered, and then collapsed into a heap of wreckage, crushing the men inside and around it. The Viking assault faltered. It was a stunning blow, a moment of reprieve bought at a high price in exhaustion and blood. Seeing the enemy momentarily disorganized, Count Odo did the unthinkable. He led a small, heavily armed party in a sortie out of the tower, a lightning-fast counterattack into the heart of the Viking lines. The surprise and ferocity of the charge drove the Northmen back from the base of the tower, allowing the Franks to set fire to the abandoned battering rams. The first great assault had failed. The Vikings, having suffered heavy casualties and with their primary siege engines destroyed, withdrew to their camp. A weary, blood-soaked cheer went up from the tower and the city walls. They had survived. They had done the impossible. But as the adrenaline faded, a chilling realization took its place. This was only the beginning. The Vikings had been repulsed, not defeated, and their patience, unlike the city's meager food supplies, was almost limitless. If you were a soldier on that wall having just survived 2 days of hell, what would be your greatest fear for the next morning? The sight of a new Viking assault or the deafening silence of a blockade, signaling a slow death by starvation? Your choice in the comments reveals a lot about how you perceive the nature of true horror. The failure of the initial assault forced a change in Viking strategy. Siegfried and his fellow chieftains realized that taking Paris by storm would be too costly. The defenders were far more determined than they had anticipated, so they settled in for the long game, a blockade. The massive Viking army established a permanent fortified camp, effectively becoming a city of its own that encircled the defenders. They controlled the river both upstream and downstream. No boat could get in or out of Paris. They sent raiding parties deep into the surrounding countryside, systematically stripping the land of all its resources. They were patient. They knew that stone walls could not be eaten. The enemy was no longer the axe-wielding warrior at the gate, but the gnawing emptiness in the belly. The war of fire and steel was over. The war of attrition had begun. For the people of Paris, the initial terror of the assault was replaced by a slow, creeping dread. Each day, the city's stockpiles of grain and salted meat dwindled a little more. Each day, the faces of their neighbors became a little gaunter, their eyes a little more hollow. Winter set in, hard and unforgiving. The cold seeped into the bones of the poorly clothed citizens. Firewood became as precious as bread. But the greatest enemy was hunger. The initial rationing gave way to meager allotments and finally to starvation. People were reduced to eating their own horses and dogs. When those were gone, they ate rats, leather, and whatever roots they could dig up within the confines of the island. The monk Abbo describes the horrific suffering in his poem, painting a grim picture of a city consuming itself to survive. With malnutrition came disease. A plague, likely a form of dysentery or typhus, began to spread through the cramped and unsanitary conditions of the besieged city. Death was no longer a stranger met in the heat of battle. It became a constant, silent companion in every home. The weak and the elderly were the first to perish, but soon the sickness began to claim the warriors as well. The city's greatest spiritual and military leader, the heroic Bishop Goslin, who had fought so bravely on the walls, succumbed to the illness. His death was a devastating blow to the morale of the defenders. It felt as if God himself had abandoned them. The Vikings, well supplied from their raids on the undefended countryside, engaged in relentless psychological warfare. They knew the defenders were watching from the walls, so they made a spectacle of their cruelty. They would parade their Frankish captives before the city, torturing and executing them in full view of their families and comrades. These grisly displays were designed to break the spirit of Paris, to convince them that their resistance was futile and that a slow, miserable death was the only reward for their defiance. At night, the sounds from the Viking camp, feasting, drinking, and singing, drifted across the water, a tormenting reminder of the life and abundance that had been stolen from the Parisians. Ghosts began to haunt the city, not supernatural spirits, but the ghosts of what might have been, the memory of a full meal, the echo of a child's healthy laughter, the shadow of a future that was now an impossible dream. Despair is a far more insidious enemy than any army. It attacks from within, corroding courage and turning hope into a bitter poison. The hope for the Emperor's army, the one thing that sustained them through the darkest days, began to fade. Months passed. Winter turned to a bleak and muddy spring. The situation grew ever more desperate. A sudden flood in February of 886, a natural disaster piled upon a man-made one, damaged the Petit Pont, the bridge connecting the city to the left bank. The wooden tower defending it was isolated, its small garrison of a dozen men cut off. The Vikings were quick to take advantage. They launched a fierce assault on the isolated tower. The dozen Franks fought with legendary courage, holding off hundreds of attackers for hours. When their position became untenable, they refused to surrender. They set fire to the tower themselves, choosing to perish in the flames rather than be captured. This act of ultimate sacrifice bought the Parisians time to partially repair the bridge, but the loss was deeply felt. The city was shrinking, its defenses crumbling one piece at a time. The gazes of the starving defenders turned ever more eastward, down the river, searching for the banners of the imperial army. Their king, their emperor, Charles the Fat, had promised to come. He was the ruler of a domain that stretched from the Atlantic to the Danube. Where was he? His silence was becoming as great a threat as the Viking horde at their gates. The man upon whom all of Paris's hopes rested was an unfortunate paradox. Emperor Charles III, known to history as Charles the Fat, was, on paper, one of the most powerful rulers in a century. Through a series of dynastic accidents and deaths, he had managed to reunite nearly all of Charlemagne's great empire under his single rule. He was King of Swabia, King of Italy, King of the West Franks, King of the East Franks, and Holy Roman Emperor. His titles were grand, his lands vast, his potential armies enormous, but the man himself was unequal to the legacy he had inherited. Charles was a weak, indecisive, and chronically ill ruler. He likely suffered from epilepsy, and his contemporaries described him as lethargic and easily manipulated by his court advisors. He was a king who preferred negotiation to conflict and comfort to duty. While Paris starved and bled, Charles was holding court in Germania, preoccupied with suppressing rebellious nobles and managing the unwieldy politics of his sprawling empire. The suffering of one city, even one as strategic as Paris, seemed a distant problem. Power without the will to use it is merely a gilded burden. Count Odo, seeing that the city could not hold out much longer, made a decision of almost suicidal bravery. He resolved to break out of the besieged city and ride to the emperor himself to plead for immediate aid. One foggy morning, under the cover of pre-dawn darkness, Odo and a small retinue of his best men slipped across the river and, through a combination of stealth and ferocious speed, broke through the Viking lines. It was an astonishing feat. They rode east day and night, killing their horses with exhaustion, their one goal to reach the emperor's court. When Odo finally arrived, disheveled and gaunt, he threw himself at Charles's feet and painted a desperate picture of the city's plight. He spoke of the heroic defense, the starvation, the plague, the death of Bishop Goslin. He begged his emperor to march the imperial army, which was already assembled, to the rescue of his loyal subjects. Charles was moved, or at least appeared to be. He praised Odo's courage and solemnly promised that he would come. He swore an oath to relieve the city. Odo, his mission accomplished, then performed his second miracle. He fought his way back through the Viking blockade and re-entered Paris, bringing with him the one currency more valuable than food: hope. The news that the emperor was coming reinvigorated the defenders. They held on through the brutal summer months, their resistance fueled by the promise of salvation. But the weeks turned into months, and the emperor's banners did not appear on the horizon. Charles, true to his indecisive nature, delayed. Why? The political situation at his court was a viper's nest of intrigue. Some of his powerful Alemannic nobles advised against the campaign, arguing that the army was needed to deal with threats on the eastern frontier. Others whispered that it was foolish to risk the entire imperial army to save a single city that was, in any case, in the heartland of his political rivals, the Robertian clan to which Odo belonged. Was it possible that the emperor was deliberately letting Paris weaken to curb the growing power of its heroic count? Politics often makes for the cruelest of bedfellows and the most cynical of strategies. While men died on the walls of Paris for the honor of the empire's leader procrastinated, weighing political calculations against human lives. The shadow of the emperor was long, but it offered no shade, only a chilling darkness that signaled a profound betrayal. Finally, in the late autumn of 886, almost a full year after the siege had begun, the imperial army arrived. It was a massive force, drawn from every corner of the empire, a truly awe-inspiring sight. The banners of Germany, Lotharingia, and Italy fluttered in the wind. The starving defenders on the walls of Paris wept with joy and relief. Their long nightmare was over. They expected a great, decisive battle, a clash of titans that would crush the Viking invaders once and for all and restore the honor of the Frankish name. The imperial army took up positions on the hill of Montmartre, overlooking the Viking camp and the besieged city. The stage was set for a historic confrontation. The Vikings, for the first time, found themselves outnumbered and trapped between the hammer of the imperial army and the anvil of the city. The Parisians waited for the command to attack, for the signal that would unleash the righteous fury of the empire. But the command never came. The emperor's horns remained silent. Charles the Fat had not come to fight. He had come to talk. The joy of the Parisians curdled into disbelief and then into bitter rage. From their vantage point on the city walls, they watched as envoys went back and forth between the emperor's camp and the Viking leaders. Emperor Charles the Fat, with a vast and superior army at his back, refused to risk a battle. His fear of the Vikings, or perhaps his fear of his own inadequacy as a commander, led him to seek the one solution his family had always preferred: payment. He entered into negotiations with Siegfried. The result of this negotiation was perhaps the single most humiliating moment in the history of the Carolingian dynasty. Charles agreed to pay the Vikings a ransom of 700 pounds of silver to lift the siege of Paris. It was an enormous sum, the equivalent of a king's fortune, paid to an enemy that he had cornered and could have destroyed. The defenders of Paris, who had sacrificed everything for nearly a year, who had starved and died in the thousands to uphold the honor of the kingdom, were sold out by their own emperor. They had held the line, but their leader had folded. But the shame did not end there. The deal had a second, even more cynical component. The Vikings had long desired to go further up the Seine to plunder the rich lands of Burgundy, a region that happened to be in a state of semi-rebellion against Charles's authority. The emperor, in an act of breathtaking political depravity, not only paid the Vikings to leave Paris alone, but also gave them official permission to continue their journey upriver. He essentially hired the barbarian horde that had just besieged his capital to punish his own rebellious subjects. The imperial army, instead of fighting the Vikings, now had the humiliating task of escorting them past the island, ensuring the Parisians did not interfere. The Northmen, their ships heavy with Frankish silver, sailed past the city, jeering at the defenders on the walls. They had arrived as invaders and were leaving as paid mercenaries of the emperor. The price of survival for Paris was the betrayal of the entire kingdom. It was a peace bought with silver and sealed with shame. History is often written by the victors, but sometimes it is defined by the cowardice of those who refuse to fight. The deal was a catastrophic moral failure, a wound from which the Carolingian Empire would never recover. For the heroes of Paris, it was a bitter, soul-crushing betrayal. They had endured a year of unimaginable suffering, holding back the tide, only to watch their emperor invite the floodwaters in to drown their neighbors. What can justify such a decision? Was Charles a realist, saving his army from a potentially bloody battle and using a convenient enemy to solve a political problem? Or was he a coward, sacrificing national honor for personal security? This question cuts to the heart of leadership. What do you believe is the greater crime for a ruler, a brave but potentially catastrophic defeat in battle, or a safe but utterly shameful betrayal of one's own people? Share your verdict in the comments below. The Vikings sailed on to Burgundy, leaving a wake of devastation, as promised. Paris was saved, but its salvation felt like a defeat. The land around the city was a barren wasteland, its villages charred ruins, its fields fallow. The population had been decimated by hunger, disease, and battle. But amidst the ashes of betrayal, something new and powerful had been forged. The heroic defense of the city had created a new leader, a new symbol of Frankish resistance, Count Odo. While the emperor had shown himself to be weak and dishonorable, Odo had been the epitome of courage and steadfastness. He had fought on the walls, shared his people's suffering, and risked his life to seek help. His fame spread throughout the kingdom of the West Franks. He was the man who had not bent, the lord who had not broken faith. He was the hero Paris had needed, and now the kingdom realized he was the leader they deserved. The contrast between Odo's valor and Charles's cowardice was stark and undeniable. A choice had been made clear not on a battlefield, but in the court of public opinion. The emperor's disgraceful actions at Paris were the final straw for the Frankish nobility. The outrage was universal. They had watched him pay an enemy he could have crushed and then unleash that same enemy upon his own lands. It was not just incompetence, it was treason. The authority of Charles the Fat, already fragile, completely disintegrated. In the year 887, just 1 year after the siege, the leading nobles of the empire convened and formally deposed him. They stripped him of his titles and sent him into a forced retirement in a monastery where he died a few months later, a broken and forgotten man. With his death, the brief and illusory reunification of Charlemagne's empire vanished forever. The great Carolingian dream was over, drowned in the muddy waters of the Seine. The empire fractured, this time permanently, into the precursor states of modern France, Germany, and Italy. The siege of Paris did not cause this collapse, but it was the dramatic public spectacle that revealed the rot at the core of the imperial house. It proved that the Carolingians were no longer fit to rule or to protect their people. From the ashes of the empire, a new power rose in the west. The nobles of the kingdom of the West Franks, disgusted with the Carolingian line, needed a new king. Their choice was obvious. In 888, they bypassed the legitimate Carolingian heir, a boy named Charles the Simple, and elected Count Odo, the hero of Paris, as their king. It was a revolutionary act. For the first time, a man who was not of Charlemagne's blood sat on the throne of the West Franks. The Robertian dynasty, Odo's family, had replaced the Carolingians. Though the crown would briefly return to the Carolingians after Odo's death, the precedent had been set. Power no longer flowed exclusively from sacred bloodlines, but from demonstrated courage and the ability to command the loyalty of the warrior aristocracy. Odo's election marked the true beginning of the French monarchy, a kingdom forged in the crucible of the siege, born from an act of heroic defiance against an external foe and an internal failure of leadership. The Vikings had come to destroy a city, but they had inadvertently helped create a nation. Paris had been a scar on the honor of the empire, but from that scar a future king emerged. The story of the siege of this pivotal moment in history survives largely thanks to one man, Abbo Cernus, or Abbo the Crooked, a monk from the Abbey of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, located just outside the city walls. He was an eyewitness to the entire ordeal, and he chronicled it in a long and detailed Latin poem titled Bella Parisiaque Urbis, The Wars of the City of Paris. His work is our primary source, a vivid, dramatic, and fiercely biased account. To Abbo, the siege was a holy war, an epic struggle between the Christian heroes of Paris and the demonic, pagan hordes of the north. Odo and Bishop Goslin are depicted as saints, their courage divinely inspired. The Vikings are portrayed as monstrous beasts, agents of Satan sent to test the faith of the godly. Abbo's poem is not a dispassionate historical record. It is a masterpiece of heroic propaganda designed to glorify the defenders and create a foundation myth for the new Robertian dynasty. He exaggerates numbers, attributes speeches, and sees divine omens in every turn of events. But beneath the poetic license lies the raw, terrified truth of a man who watched his world almost end. Reading Abbo's account raises a fascinating question about the nature of history itself. We see the events through his eyes, the eyes of the besieged. His poem is a testament to Frankish suffering and valor. But what of the other side? How did the Vikings remember this year-long campaign? The frustrating answer is they likely barely remembered it at all. In the vast corpus of Scandinavian sagas and runestones, which celebrate the deeds of great Viking warriors, the siege of Paris of 885 is a footnote at best. It is mentioned in passing, if at all. For the Franks, it was a defining, nation-shaping trauma. For the Vikings, it was just another stop on a long and profitable tour of plunder. It was a business trip, a successful one at that, which ended with a massive payout of 700 pounds of silver. They did not see themselves as demonic destroyers, but as pragmatic opportunists. They were not fighting a holy war, they were earning a living in the manner of their ancestors. This stark difference in perspective reveals the great irony of historical memory. One civilization's apocalypse can be another's lucrative Tuesday. This battle for memory shaped the future of France. Abbo's poem and other chronicles cemented the legend. Paris became the city that could not be taken, the symbol of national resilience. Odo became the first in a line of national heroes, the savior of his people. The story was told and retold, a founding myth for a new kingdom. It served a vital political purpose, legitimizing the transfer of power from the failed Carolingians to the heroic Robertians and their descendants, the Capetian dynasty, who would rule France for centuries. The historical event was transformed into a cultural touchstone, a story about courage in the face of impossible odds, and the triumph of a local hero over a failed monarch. History is not simply what happened, it is the story we choose to tell about what happened. And the story the Franks chose to tell was one of heroic survival against all odds, conveniently editing out the final, shameful chapter of their emperor's betrayal and focusing instead on the glory of the fight itself. The myth became more important than the reality, for myths, unlike reality, can build kingdoms. The unlearned lesson of the siege of Paris was that paying the Danegeld was not a solution. It was a subscription service for continued invasion. The 700 pounds of silver Charles the Fat paid did not buy peace. It simply confirmed that the Frankish kingdom was a wealthy and vulnerable target. In the years that followed, Viking raids not only continued but intensified. They sailed up the Loire, the Garonne, and the Scheldt, plundering with impunity. King Odo spent much of his heroic reign fighting them, rushing from one end of his kingdom to the other to counter new threats. He was a valiant warrior, but he could not be everywhere at once. The strategy of static defense and periodic payments was a dismal failure. It took another generation of bloodshed for the Frankish leadership to realize that a fundamental shift in strategy was required. The Vikings could not be beaten back and they could not be bought off. They were a permanent feature of the European landscape. If you cannot defeat your enemy, perhaps the only solution is to make them your friend. Or more accurately, your guard dog. This radical new idea came to fruition in the year 911. The king of the West Franks was now another Charles, this one, ironically, known as Charles the Simple. A Viking army led by a formidable chieftain named Rollo, a man who may very well have been a young warrior at the Great Siege of Paris, had established a permanent base at the mouth of the Seine, near the city of Rouen. They were a constant threat to Paris and the heartland of the kingdom. Charles the Simple, unable to dislodge them by force, offered Rollo a revolutionary deal. It was a pact that would change the map of Europe forever. He did not offer Rollo silver. He offered him land. He granted Rollo and his men the entire territory around the Lower Seine, a region that would soon come to be known as Normandy, the land of the Northmen. In exchange for this rich and fertile duchy, Rollo had to agree to 3 conditions. First, he had to cease his own raiding against the kingdom. Second, and most importantly, he had to become a vassal of the king and defend the Seine from any other Viking raiders who might try to sail upriver. Third, he and his men had to accept baptism and convert to Christianity. Rollo, a pragmatic leader, accepted. He was baptized, married the king's daughter, and became the first Duke of Normandy. The poacher had been turned into the gamekeeper. In a single stroke of brilliant diplomacy, Charles the Simple had neutralized the most dangerous threat to his kingdom by giving the invaders a stake in its defense. The Vikings of Normandy, fierce and warlike as ever, now turned their energies to protecting their new home. They became the shield of the kingdom of the Franks, a buffer against further Scandinavian incursions. The Northmen, who had once come to burn Christian churches, now became their staunchest defenders. They assimilated with astonishing speed, adopting the French language, Frankish feudal customs, and the Christian religion, all while retaining their own restless, adventurous Viking spirit. This fusion of Scandinavian warrior culture and Frankish civilization created one of the most dynamic and powerful political entities in European history. The very men who had besieged Paris became the guardians of its main artery to the sea. The story of the Siege of Paris is thus a profound and deeply ironic tale. It is a story of incredible heroism rendered meaningless by political cowardice. It is a story of an empire's humiliating death and a nation's painful birth. It shows how the greatest threat can come not from a foreign enemy, but from the weakness of one's own leaders. But ultimately, it is a story about adaptation. The Franks, unable to defeat the Vikings with swords or buy them off with silver, finally learned to absorb them through land and faith. The creation of Normandy was the final and most successful answer to the problem that had begun with Ragnar Lothbrok's first raid. The descendants of Rollo the Normans would go on to conquer England in 1066, establish kingdoms in Sicily and the Holy Land, and fundamentally reshape the destiny of Western Europe. The dragon had not been slain. It had been tamed and given a permanent lair from which it would guard the very kingdom it once sought to devour. The heroes of Paris saved their city through battle, but their emperor bought a shameful peace. Years later, another king gave away a piece of his country to create a lasting one. History offers no easy answers, only complex choices. So, to protect your home and your future, what would you ultimately place your faith in? A heroic, but perhaps hopeless, battle to the death? Or a difficult but potentially brilliant compromise with your sworn enemy? Tell us your choice in the comments, for this question remains at the very heart of our own modern conflict.